Hey guys, what's up? My name is Mr. G, and today, in American Traditions, we're talking about the French and Indian War. So let's go ahead and jump right in. When we talk about the French and Indian War, that's what we here in the US call it, because we're Americans and we're awesome. The rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War. And so a little bit of background on the 7 Years' War. Basically, the 7 Years' War was the result of tensions left behind by the War of Austrian Succession. I'm not going to get too in the weeds of European history, although I might do a European history series later on. But the War of Austrian Succession was, well, about who would succeed the Austrian throne. So while the War of Austrian Succession raged across Europe, it was also fought in other parts of the world. And when it ended, it really didn't end the tensions between the European powers. So what we see is Britain and France were really vying for power both in Europe and in the colonies. Likewise, Prussia and Austria were at odds with one another. So because of some of these tensions in Europe, we see the effects basically spread all over the world as basically our First World War kicks off. On one side, we end up with Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and strangely enough, the Iroquois Confederacy. Not a major European power, but instead a group of Indian nations aligned with Britain and its colonies. On the other side, we see France, Austria, Russia, Spain, and Sweden, as well as Native American tribes like the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Ottawa. And so this war between these many powers spread all over the world. But most of the fighting was concentrated in Europe and America. And so just to pique your interest and maybe gauge whether or not I should make a series on European history, I'll just go over some of the basics in the war in Europe. See, France and Austria had long time been rivals for centuries, but now France found itself rivaling Britain and aligned with Austria. See, France and Britain were still contesting these colonies abroad, specifically in North America. And so Russia, seeking to join in and seeing Prussia as a major threat on their border, joins alongside France and Austria to fight Britain and Prussia. And so in Europe, the fighting was brutal. It raged across the continent and across the seas. But really, under the superb leadership of a rising star, Frederick the Great, it allowed him to force a draw with the Austrian, French, and Russian armies and really lock up the war in Europe. Now, Britain would also have success, although not so much in Europe, more so in North America. See, France controlled a lot more territory in North America than the British did. The British had their small 13 colonies, but they were densely packed compared to the loosely colonized territory that the French controlled. Most of the fighting in the French and Indian War was in the regions of Canada as well as the Ohio River Valley. And so we know that the reason for this war in North America is because these big colonial empires basically wanted the same turf. France had been making a lot of money in the fur trade, trading with Native American tribes, and so Britain really wanted a piece of the action, even though their cash crops of tobacco and cotton were doing just fine. Nowhere was this tension more pronounced than the question of who would control the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley, which is now in modern-day Pennsylvania and Ohio and a couple other places, was really strategically important for trade and for connecting the empires. It's also important to note that the tensions between different Native American tribes also led to an escalation of this conflict. Contrary to what many people think, Native American tribes did not get along with one another. Most of the time, they were at war with one another because they were competing for the same scarce resources after being pushed off their lands by settlers. And so that meant that tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy were looking for a way to push out tribes like the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Ottawa. And so aligning themselves with the British gave them a better chance to do that. And oftentimes, the British and the Iroquois goals were much the same. They wanted wealth, they wanted power, and they wanted to really take off in the fur trade. This is also where we see the entrance of a young George Washington. George Washington, who's about 27 at the time, really begins his military career as a lieutenant in the Virginia militia. And so he was tasked with going out to the Ohio River Valley and stopping the French. Now, he's going to have some mixed success during the 7 Years' War, but he is going to learn a lot. Nowhere would he learn more than under the leadership of General Edward Bulldog Braddock. George Washington will eventually become his aide-de-camp and learn a lot of strategy and a lot of leadership skills from the famous general. Many historians are also arguing now that Washington is likely responsible for starting the first battles of the French and Indian War. And so this leads us to the Battle of Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity. See, George Washington was tasked with stopping the French advances in the Ohio River Valley. And so on May 28th, 1754, when Washington and his men are marching through the Ohio River Valley, they come across a French scouting party. And rather than making contact or sending an envoy, Washington, young and hoping to gain quick victory and notoriety, decides to ambush them. New historical research has found that this scouting party actually had on them diplomatic documents seeking to come to a peaceful resolution about the Ohio River Valley. Well, the news of this scandalous ambush against the French scouting party soon made its way to Fort Duquesne, what is now modern-day Pittsburgh. The French had a large military presence there, and it became very clear to a young Washington that he was going to need to mount a defense because there would be a retaliation for this attack. And so Washington's forces hastily construct a fort. This Fort Necessity, as it was called, was not the best fort. It was thrown together rather quickly. It was very hard to defend. It was in the middle of an open field. The location for it was not particularly good. And so because of this, the fort was quickly overwhelmed by the French, and on July 3rd, a little bit over a month after the attack on the French scouting party, Washington was forced to surrender to the French and give up his military saber. This defeat would seriously harm Washington's pride, but it would also humble him. Washington vowed from this point on to not let this kind of defeat happen again. Well, later on in the war, we see the tides change for Washington. Washington, under General Edward Bulldog Braddock, had really learned a lot about leadership and a lot about making sound decisions on the battlefield. No longer was George Washington this jumpy 27-year-old who was looking to make a name for himself. He was a lot more disciplined by the time we get to the Battle of Monongahela. See, Bulldog Braddock was sent to capture Fort Duquesne, that same fort that had sent troops to attack Fort Necessity. On their way to Fort Duquesne, they were ambushed. And so in the commotion, in the ambush, Braddock was fatally shot, leaving his aide-de-camp, George Washington, in charge. And so Washington really steps up here. We see Washington is able to organize the British forces and manage a retreat where instead of surrendering to the French, they get to retreat and live to fight another day. This battle, even though it was a loss, was seen as a victory for George Washington in that he pulled a minor defeat out of a potential disaster. A little fun fact, the Battle of Monongahela happened in what would now be called Braddock, Pennsylvania. So the place where Braddock is killed and the place where this battle happens now bear his name. And so the war had a profound effect on George Washington. See, Washington had a mixed bag from the French and Indian War. While outwardly people praised him for his actions during the Battle of Monongahela, and he got a reputational boost because of his competent leadership and his connection to this famous general, Bulldog Braddock, Washington internally felt like he had failed his men at various times throughout this campaign. He had learned some very harsh lessons about leadership in the early battles like the Battle of Fort Necessity. And he had also learned how to become a disciplined and skilled leader and lead a skilled and disciplined army. These would come to help benefit him later on as he was selected to become the commander-in-chief for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And so while there were many other battles, ultimately the French and Indian War ends with the Treaty of Paris, as does the rest of the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris, this one specifically in 1763, because there's many treaties of Paris, ended the war. While the end was definitely beneficial to Britain, it did very little for the American colonists. France had ceded all of Canada and its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. It also ceded its territories west of the Mississippi River, the Louisiana Territory, to Spain. And so while this was a great win for Britain, and now it controlled all this land, the colonists did not really get to reap these rewards. Britain would ban colonial settlers from settling these new lands. And so while Britain gained all the territory from Florida all the way up to Canada, it became clear that while this favored the mother country, like the mercantilist system that was being used at the time, the benefits didn't always make their way to the colonists. While this definitely benefited the mother country, the colonists were not reaping their rewards of the victory here. And so the aftermath of the French and Indian War is profound. Britain now has dominance over North America, and France has retreated from North America entirely. The French no longer control the Louisiana Territory, they no longer control Canada, and Britain has complete control over the eastern half of the continent. The war's outcome would lead to serious tensions between the British and the American colonies. See, Britain had paid not just for a war in the Americas, but they had also paid for this war across the ocean in Europe. And so with these massive war debts, this is going to lead to an increase of taxation in the colonies. This taxation is going to become a massive point of contention for the colonies going forward. Now, while the French and Indian War had a profound effect on the continent, it's not the only war that the colonies were involved in. See, shortly after the French and Indian War, we get to an event called Pontiac's War. And so even before the French and Indian War, relationships between the colonists and the Indian tribes were complex and oftentimes violent, right? Going all the way back to Jamestown, we know that there were disagreements and disputes and fights between colonists and the Native Americans that lived there. Well, this comes to a head in the early 1760s. See, Neolin, an Indian prophet, had received a vision. His vision was that the American Indian tribes would rise up against the European settlers, expel them from the Americas, and gain entry to not only heaven, but gain access to the lands that had once been theirs. Pontiac, an Ottawa leader, was inspired by this message to lead a rebellion against the European colonists. And so while Pontiac is contemplating and internalizing this message, we also see changes after the war that lead in quick succession to Pontiac's War. See, after the 7 Years' War, Britain had now gained control of these French territories. The Ottawa, which was the tribe of Pontiac, had had a peaceful relationship with the French. The British sought to control, and specifically control the profit of, the fur trade. And so that meant that tribes like the Ottawa were placed in subservience to the British trading government. Likewise, British policy at the time discouraged diplomacy, discouraged mutual gift-giving, which was a major part of diplomacy with Native Americans at the time, and it also regulated what arms could be traded with Native Americans versus could not be traded. And so in the eyes of many Indians, like Pontiac, this was seen as preparation for war. This control over their business and the fur trade, their control over diplomacy and the arms trade, really made many leaders like Pontiac suspicious of Britain's intentions with their new territory. And so, in May of 1763, Pontiac and 300 warriors attempt a surprise attack on Fort Detroit. Now, while the plan failed, it did lead to a 6-month siege of the fort. During the siege of the fort, the word spread this Indian uprising against the colonists, and this inspired other Native American tribes to go on their own offensives. And so we see Native Americans go on to capture Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, and Fort Miami, all within that same month. And so as this war spreads out from Fort Detroit to now being a much larger war between colonists and Native Americans. Now, while the war would last an additional 3 years, eventually it would die down in 1766, with disease and supply shortages weakening the Native American war effort. Ultimately, a peace is brought forth in July of 1766, with William Johnson, as the British representative, signing a peace treaty with the Native Americans. And so, by the war's end, over 400 British and colonial soldiers had been killed, mostly colonials. Likewise, over 200 English settlers had also been killed. And so we see, as the war winds down and a peace is found, there is a big divide between the British government and what they hoped to get out of this peace and what the colonists hoped to get out of this peace. Towards the beginning of the war, the British had issued the Royal Proclamation of 1760. They established a boundary where the British colonists could no longer move, stating that certain lands were British lands. And so all this territory that they had just won from the French, that many colonists had spilled blood for, was now cut off to them. And so many settlers found themselves wondering why they had fought the 7 Years' War and why they had fought in Pontiac's War if they were not allowed to settle in these areas that they had conquered. And so this led to discontent amongst the American colonists who wanted to expand westward. This also had the effect of unifying the American colonies politically and culturally. See, the colonists saw that the British aims in the war were not aligned with their aims as colonists. In fact, what Britain wanted out of both the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War went counter to what the colonists wanted. The colonists wanted to spread westward and to find new environments and economic opportunities. And here was the British government telling them that they could not do that. And so, as we can see, these two conflicts, the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, are going to have profound effects in unifying the colonies and also sowing the seeds of discontent for the road to revolution. So, that's all I got for you guys today. My name is Mr. G. It's been great. I'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can go ahead and hit that little notification bell so that way you get updates every time I post a video. My name is Mr. G, and I'll see you next time.